Hey folks, and welcome to our first video on the film art movement known as German Expressionism. German Expressionism usually refers to an art movement that consists of several related creative movements in Germany before World War I that reached a peak in Berlin in the 1920s. One of the most important aspects of German Expressionism as a general artistic movement in Germany is, of course, its contribution to cinema. These developments were part of a larger expressionist movement in North and Central European culture across the arts, in architecture, dance, painting, and sculpture. So to begin to understand German Expressionism as a film movement, we need to understand the general idea of Expressionism. What is Expressionism, and what do we mean when we say Expressionism? The typical trait of Expressionism is to present the world solely from a subjective perspective, distorting it radically for emotional effect in order to evoke a kind of mood. The key word here, I think, is emotion. There are many kinds of artistic movements that depart from the depiction of reality, but Expressionism is a way of departing from reality that invokes a particular feeling or emotion, usually as it's related to human beings within a world. And the film critic and scholar Lottie Eisner, in her book The Haunted Screen, perhaps the most famous and most widely read book on the German Expressionist movement in cinema, echoes this idea. She says, "The Expressionist does not see, he has visions. Only the interior vision he provokes exists." So once again, that idea that Expressionism is all about taking some kind of interior feeling and putting it out into the world. And I think we can detect the essence of the idea if we just look at the word express. Express comes from the Latin pressare, to press, and the prefix ex, which means out. So to express etymologically means to press out, to obtain by squeezing, to get that which is inside of something out. Think about expressing a sponge, squeezing it so that the water gushes out. Expressionism takes emotions or feelings that are within us and pushes them out into the world so that they're visible. So I think this logic of Expressionism is made really clear if we look at a famous Expressionist painting. This isn't a German painting, this is a Norwegian painting by the artist Edvard Munch called The Scream. You've probably seen it before. So what makes this painting expressionist? The first thing that I think we might notice is the human figure. The human figure does not look realistic. It's not rendered realistically. It looks like an exaggerated caricature of a human being. Notice the elongated skull and the way that the hands placed upon the sides of the face perfectly conform in line and curve to the sides of the face. Notice that this exaggerated, unrealistic drawing style conveys a heightened, exaggerated emotion, that of terror or anxiety or fear. But the human figure alone wouldn't make this painting expressionist. What really marks the painting as an expressionist work is the relationship between the human figure and their environment. So notice the way that the background is painted sort of grows out of the lines of the human figure itself. You can see the curve of the head and the hand on the right side of the human figure's body seems to emanate out into those lines of the landscape behind them. Human figure and environment are perfectly in sync. And it's almost as if the emotions in the human figure are spilling out into the depiction of the world beyond them. And notice also the way that the lines that seem to emanate from the right side of the human figure continue on to fill out the rest of the painting, especially the background. What's also been noted quite a bit with this painting is the use of color. The sky is made up of these stark reds and oranges. Perhaps they might convey the colors that are typical of a sunset, but they do seem exaggerated, oversaturated, strange, and warped. And you also might note that the figure in the center is not the only human figure in the painting. On the bridge in which the human figure is standing are these two other figures who are barely rendered and who don't seem to share the turmoil of the main character. They just seem to be ordinarily walking in the same space. So whatever is affecting our main character doesn't seem to be affecting the people around him, making the main figure feel as if his suffering is alone, that his suffering is only by himself. And this sort of reinforces this central feeling that this painting is said to give us. The overall impression that you get is one of terror and anxiety. And the painting has become a kind of universal symbol of anxiety in general. So how do we kind of distill the essence of Expressionism? Well, another way of doing that is to compare Expressionism to a contemporaneous art movement. So if Expressionism is associated with an emphasis on subjective feeling, especially feelings of anxiety and fear, is not usually marked by a kind of negative or dark tone. Really, the Impressionists were largely concerned with an emphasis on an accurate depiction of light, especially in its changing qualities, like with the passage of time and motion that you'll get with one of these haystack paintings from Monet in 1890. While both of these paintings might be said to have that similar style of visible brushstrokes, that is a major departure from, say, academic painting in the 18th century that strives for a kind of perfect illusionism, what distinguishes the Expressionist painting from the Impressionist painting is a logic of how depiction is connected with subjectivity of a character or of a human figure. So once again, if you look at another notable Expressionist painting, that of Knight Errant by Oskar Kokoschka from 1915, you'll again see those visible brushstrokes that you might want to associate with Impressionism, but notice the exaggeratedness of the way this is depicted, the extreme colors that don't at all correspond with an objective reality, the contorted body of the human figure, the background that almost seems to give us a kind of storm, or lines that suggest a kind of otherworldly intensity. And then compare this to an Impressionist painting, once again from Monet. You get those visible brushstrokes, but they're not put in the service of representing an interior turmoil. In fact, the basic relations between human figures and their environments is rather realistic. So how do we get from Expressionism to the topic of this lecture, which is German Expressionist cinema? German Expressionist cinema usually refers to major German films made between 1919 and 1926. You can generally think of the long 1920s as being the time for German Expressionist cinema. I want to start with a little bit of history. There were a number of factors that led to this art movement in Germany in the 1920s. One of them, of course, was that in 1916, Germany banned all foreign films, leading to increased domestic filmmaking. So during World War I, Germany was making up for the fact that it banned foreign films by largely increasing production. A lot more movies were being made. After 1916 than in the years before. So that allowed a lot of filmmakers the chance to experiment and, in a sense, to compete with Hollywood filmmaking. And one of the main ways to compete with Hollywood filmmaking is to offer something that Hollywood doesn't do. German Expressionism is largely an avant-garde, or in some sense a modernist film movement that goes against the Hollywood conventions that were already established in the 19-teens. And of course, the major event that's going to stimulate the mindset of the German Expressionist filmmaker is the horror of World War I. From 1919 to 1926, Germany was in social and economic disarray after World War I, after losing the war. German Expressionism is a movement that's associated with darkness, with anxiety, with the suspicion of power and authority, and you can see that as a result of what happened in World War I. Lottie Eisner echoes this in her book, The Haunted Screen. She says, the years immediately following the First World War were strange ones in Germany. The German mind had difficulty in adjusting itself to the collapse of the imperial dream, and inflation could not be stopped. What she's referring to here, of course, is the staggering inflation of German currency. She says the material conditions which resulted led to a general decline of values, and the inner disquiet of the nation took on truly gigantic proportions. So even though I think it's a bit facile and reductive to say that the aesthetic of German Expressionism is directly tied to the suffering, the loss, and the instability of post-World War I Germany, I do think it's probably the most important connection between aesthetics and history when we're talking about German Expressionism. So what are the aesthetic characteristics of German Expressionism? And I do want to spend a little bit more time here. Probably the most notable characteristic of German Expressionism is distorted, exaggerated, and unrealistic mise-en-scène. That means set design, lighting, costume, makeup. That is understood to express interior states of characters. The most famous and notable German Expressionist film that illustrates this, which we'll talk about more in depth in another video, is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Wiene from 1920. So to give a simple example of that exaggerated set design, we need to look no further than this particular image, which shows how the set designers of this particular film would not only make exaggerated geometric sets that didn't correspond to actual architecture in the world, but they would also go so far as to paint shadows and lights onto the sets itself. So we have a street lamp here in this exaggerated geometric set design, but underneath it you can actually see this kind of star pattern that represents, not in an illusionistic way, but an expressive way, the light cast on the floor. Lottie Eisner will talk about her own favorite example of the set design of Caligari in this moment. She talks about this moment in the film where we look at a prison cell. She says the abstraction and the total distortion of the Caligari sets are seen at their most extreme in the vision of the prison cell, with its verticals narrowing as they rise like arrowheads. The oppressive effect is heightened by these verticals being extended along the floor and directed at the spot where the chain-laden prisoner squats. In this hell, the distorted rhomboid window is a mockery. The designers succeeded in rendering the idea of a jail in the absolute in its most expressive expression. So I think this is a great description of what the effect of these set designs are. In a sense, what she's saying here is that Expressionism doesn't just distort for the sake of distortion. It distorts in order to enhance a particular mood or feeling. In the sense, in this particular shot, the set design is warping the traditional look of a jail cell in order to emphasize the feeling of being confined and oppressed. All of the lines kind of tower over the figure in the center. The lines create shapes that have sharp points. And the window at the top, she calls a mockery. That is a mockery of an actual window that would serve the purpose of giving a view to the outside world. All of these things create what she calls a jail in the absolute. A jail cell that exaggerates the feeling of being confined and restricted and oppressed. So where else can we see these exaggerated set designs? So you can see similar, even more exaggerated set designs in a film like From Morn to Midnight from 1920, seen here. And you can see a different kinds of exaggeration in the film The Golem, How He Came into the World, also from 1920. Notice that what constitutes an exaggerated set design is going to be different across many German Expressionist films. The set design of The Golem is not exactly geometric and abstract, but it is exaggerated and warped and evocative of a mood. Lottie Eisner will continue her discussion of the set design of German Expressionism, and she'll do something which I think is really useful for homing in on what is particular about German Expressionist cinema. So she'll say, when Abel Gance, a French filmmaker, had made his own attempt at filming a world seen through the eyes of a madman, he had gone about it in quite a different way. In his film La Folie, knowing nothing of anamorphic lenses, he borrowed several concave and convex mirrors from a hall of mirrors in a nearby amusement park and filmed the reflections of people and objects, occasionally obtaining mere blobs and wavy lines. This, she says, was a fundamentally impressionistic use of the camera. The distortions of Dr. Caligari, however, lie in the basic graphic idea and can therefore be termed expressionistic. So I think this distinction is quite useful, even if the passage isn't quite making it clear. Distorting an image to reflect the subjective perception of a character is not exactly what makes something expressionistic. German Expressionist films are not simply using camera techniques to evoke the momentary subjective experience of a character. Rather, the entire world of a German Expressionist film feels inflected with the moods of characters, with a kind of dark and somber, anxious mood. That, I think, is one of the essences of German Expressionism. It's how subjectivity is placed into the world. Okay, let's get back to some of the visual markers of German Expressionism. Another one is emphasis on shadows and silhouettes, and in general, high contrast imagery. You can see that in the image from Caligari that I have here to your right, and you can see this use of shadows in this moment from Caligari. The film, very briefly, is about a hypnotist named Dr. Caligari, and he has his subject named Cesare, who he hypnotizes in order to command to kill various people within the village. And in the first murder, we see it through shadow. In cinema, this now seems like a kind of cliche, but it's a cliche because it was established by these films in Germany from the 1920s. We can see similar kinds of shots from Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau, which is the first surviving filmic adaptation of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. In the same film, we can actually see this moment where the shadow of Nosferatu's hand clutches at the heart of his victim, and the shadow has actual material consequences. A third characteristic of German Expressionist cinema is a kind of vague aesthetic sensibility where characters seem to merge with the setting. We already talked about the way that in The Scream, one of the notable aesthetic features is that the human figure seems to aesthetically merge with the setting, as if the lines that form the figure bleed out into the background. We can see a similar kind of thing in this bit of illustration for a poster for a cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Notice the way in which the female figure blends into the environment, how the contours of her body that go from her shoulders to her waist to her feet perfectly recreate the converging lines of perspective that form the pathway that she's on. In an almost abstract and geometric way, the lines that make up her body conform to the lines that make up the environment behind her. And these very careful and deliberate relations between human figures and their environments can be seen throughout Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This is the scene in which Caligari's hypnotized subject is going to murder the woman that our protagonist loves. This is the first shot that we see in which he is emerging outside of her window. Notice a few things here. First, we have an iris effect that emphasizes sharp angles. But then you'll notice that those sharp angles, especially the motif of acute triangles that point down, can be seen on the left and the right side of the screen. And now consider that when we take a wider view, above those two ornaments that we saw earlier are much larger and more menacing triangles that now come to take on the look of a blade pointing downward. And wonderfully, right in between those two blades is Cesare himself, who was walking in such a way, one foot in front of the other, as if to make his own body a pointed blade. Notice how tight and stilted his movement is, such that black silhouette of his body forms a very similar shape to the blade-like shapes on his left and right. Lottie Eisner will in fact note that one of the hallmarks of German Expressionist cinema is a certain kind of performance style. She says, through a reduction of gesture, the actors attain movements which are almost linear and which remain brusque, like the broken angles of the sets, which I think is perfectly illustrated here. And then finally note that the kind of graphic payoff of this entire sequence is made when Cesare takes out his knife and lifts it above his head so that we can see how it perfectly echoes the motif of those blade-like shapes that we saw earlier. It's almost as if every little detail of the set, including the actor's performance, portends the violence of the action in this sequence. The violence tied to the very shape of the murder weapon, the knife. You can see similar moments where performance style and gesture correspond with the environment, such as here when Cesare's strange posture and gesture, which seems otherworldly, unnatural, stilted, robotic, seems to quite deliberately mimic the shape of the exaggerated trees in the set. And to see how this is executed in another German Expressionist film by the same filmmaker, Genuine from 1920 by Robert Wiene, notice here how the posture of the woman on the left perfectly corresponds with the lines behind her. She holds this posture in one sense to evoke the distance that she's creating with the male figure on the right. Right, and both of them kind of hold their bodies at angles to reflect his pursuit and her retreat. But also notice how the lines in the background wall seem to spill out from her gesture. And the final thing that I want to note about the characteristics of German Expressionism is a kind of dark and moody narrative and tone. If you just look at a cluster of the most exemplary German Expressionist films, they all kind of have a dark, moody, mystical quality. It's important to note that the core idea of Expressionism, which is that interior feelings express themselves in the exterior world, doesn't necessarily need to imply that those feelings are dark and anxious, but it tends to be the case that when we're talking about German Expressionism, those feelings are almost exclusively dark. And Eisner will talk about this. She says, mysticism and magic, the dark forces to which Germans have always been more than willing to commit themselves, had flourished in the face of death on the battlefields. That is, the battlefields of World War I. A new stimulus was thus given to the eternal attraction towards all that is obscure and undetermined, towards the kind of brooding, speculative reflection called Grübele, that is brooding, which culminated in the apocalyptic doctrine of Expressionism. So you don't have to accept Eisner's essentialism of the German people, which is sort of littered throughout her entire book, but all I want to pull out of this passage is the sense that if German Expressionism is inevitably tied to feelings spilling out of post-World War I Germany, it makes sense that German Expressionism is an almost exclusively dark cinematic movement, also full of mysticism and magic, flirtations with the supernatural.